Hey there, this is Eric Vanman. I'm a professor in psychology at the University of Queensland in Australia, and I'm here today to talk to you about the differences between American and Australian universities, particularly from a student's point of view. I hope to have a second video after this that'll tell you more about the differences in teaching or being a professor at these two kinds of universities. Now, a little bit about my background. I'm originally from the United States. I went to the University of Iowa, which is a large state university in the middle of the United States, and then I went to the University of Southern California for my PhD. And in the University of Southern California, it was a private university. It's actually quite a large university as well. I think it had 30,000 students at the time. And it's in Los Angeles. And then after I was at the University of Southern California, I went to Texas A&M University for a year in a research position. Texas A&M is a very large state university in Texas. After I was done there, I went to Emory University and had some teaching jobs there. Emory is a smaller private university in Atlanta. And then after I was at Emory, I went to Georgia State University, which is a large, again, state university in the middle of Atlanta. Then in 2007, I moved here to the University of Queensland in Brisbane, Australia. And the University of Queensland is a very large university, 50,000 students. So it gives you a little bit of an idea of the different kinds of universities I've been at. And I just want to give a couple other caveats or these little introductory comments here. First of all, keep in mind these are all my opinions based on my experiences. And because I haven't been at all the universities in the United States or in Australia, I obviously could say some things here that are not correct about what it's like to be at an American or an Australian university. I also haven't taught at an American university for 15 years, so things may have changed since I was there. Another thing that I just need to make sure you understand is that in the United States, we call universities colleges sometimes, and this is a bit of a misnomer because a large number of universities in America actually are universities. A university in the United States is actually a collection of colleges that are all together under the same umbrella. You might have a College of Medicine, College of Arts and Sciences, College of Law, and they're all grouped under the banner of Cornell University or whatever it is. So in the United States, they still call that going to college. So students will say, I'm going to college, and they could mean that they're going to university, just like they would mean here in Australia. In Australia, everybody calls it university. They don't call it college. In fact, they use the word college for things that happen in high school. There are high schools that are called colleges. There are colleges on university campuses where students live. They're like residential colleges. And then there are also colleges for like beauty and other things that could exist. So you don't hear students saying they're going to college the way they would in the United States. They say they're going to uni or university. Let's just start with one basic fact. There are many more universities in the United States than there are in Australia. In Australia, there actually are 43 universities. 37 of them are public and 4 are private. There's a couple more that are basically campuses from other international universities that have a campus on some grounds here in Australia. But that's it. There's really just these 43 universities in Australia. In the US, by contrast, there are over 7,000 colleges and universities. In the United States, they've been going back since the 1600s, but in Australia, the first university was actually established at the University of Sydney in 1850. That was followed by the University of Melbourne in 1853, the University of Adelaide in 1874, and the University of Tasmania in 1890. All of these universities that were set up here in Australia were controlled by their respective state governments, and it's still the case today that every state and territory has a large public university or 2 or 3 that are modeled after traditional British universities and get their funding from the federal government, even though the state is actually sort of controlling what's happening there. By the time of 1914, there were 6 universities in Australia, and there were only 3,300 students in all of Australia enrolled at university. It kind of stayed that way through World War II. In fact, by the time we get to World War II, Australia's population was 8 million, but there were only 14,236 students enrolled in university in Australia. 81 of those were doing advanced degrees, getting a master's or a PhD. 81. So it wasn't like something that you would do regularly here in Australia before World War II to get a PhD or a master's degree. So anyway, that's a very low number of students. So Australia really didn't have this sort of tradition of sending people off to university until after World War II. Prior to World War II, universities were largely looked at as vocational training, where you would learn about agriculture or mining or how to be a teacher. There was very little research done at universities before World War II. In fact, there was so little research that the Australian government was concerned about this, and they set up this organization called CSIRO, C-S-I-R-O, which CSIRO was an independent, federally funded research institution that still exists today that did primarily most of the research for the country. And that was the case up until after World War II. After World War II, the enrollments doubled. So by the 1950s, you had twice as many people going to university, and more universities were founded to kind of meet the demand. Up until 1973, if you wanted to go to university in Australia, you would pay fees, or you may be lucky enough to get a scholarship based on your merit, like how well you did in high school. But there were concerns in the early 70s that there were just too low of numbers of people going off to universities, particularly those from working and middle-class families. And so they dropped the fees. They made them free. Universities were free. As long as you could get into the university, you wouldn't have to pay anything. And this immediately increased the university enrollments, and you saw all of the universities greatly expand the number of students that went there. You had more campuses opening up, and so it was a great success. However, by the early 1980s, the federal government that was basically paying for all these costs, the federal government said, can't do this anymore, we can't afford it. And so even though it was just a short time before that they had had a free education, they now imposed fees again. But this time what they did is they introduced something called the Higher Education Contribution Scheme, or the HECS, H-E-C-S, which allows students to defer paying their fees for university until a time that they can actually afford it. So they have to, and when they later on in their life actually have a regular paying job and they're paying taxes at above a certain threshold, then what happens is the government deducts these fees, deducts money from their pay to pay for those fees, pay for those fees, just like they would do for income tax. And that just happens over the gradual time of the course that you work at university. I'm sorry, that you have that job. Now, what about in the US? Well, the US system, as I already mentioned, is a lot older in terms of how many colleges and universities they've had up until, go all the way back to the 1600s. And even though they had this large number of colleges and universities up until the 1800s, the only people who could really attend them were white men. And so upper class men who would go off and learn how to become, for instance, get a degree in divinity or in law or something like that. It wasn't until the Civil War, or just after the Civil War, that you saw, for instance, colleges were established for women to attend college at last because they weren't allowed to attend regular universities. This is also when you saw the establishment of historically black colleges and universities to allow for the education of African Americans who were not allowed to generally be admitted to universities in the traditional sense. But by the turn of the 20th century, there were now 1,000 colleges in the United States with 160,000 students enrolled in them. Every state soon established multiple public universities and colleges that received their funding largely from the state, although there was some funding that would come from the federal government. The 20th century also saw the establishment of junior colleges that were later renamed community colleges. A community college is generally very localized. It's meant for people who it might not be far from where somebody went to high school, and allows them to continue to do 2 more years of higher education, basically fulfilling some requirements that maybe they could then use to transfer to another 4-year university or college. And so that's a common way that people get an associate's degree, that's called, after you've just done these 2 years at community college, that you can then apply to another college. You should also just realize that there's these other distinctions that are made. We've already talked about the distinction between a university and a college. You also will hear the term in the United States of a liberal arts college. A liberal arts college is a college where there isn't anything else there except for that college, basically. It doesn't give master's or PhD degrees, generally speaking. And they focus more on sort of a broad liberal arts education, not so specialized. And then the idea is that you would receive your degree from this more generalized approach and then go off and do something like for a master's or a PhD. You also will hear about institutes like the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. There are academies like the Naval Academy. There are schools like the Juilliard School. These are all considered colleges or universities for the sake of this discussion. One other big thing I just want to again highlight, I mentioned that there's only really 4 private universities. In fact, the first private university in Australia was Bond University. And so that was in the 1980s. So Australia doesn't really have a tradition of private universities, whereas the United States has many, many private universities and colleges. In fact, some of those older, more prestigious universities in the United States are in fact private, like Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Stanford. And all of those private universities and colleges that have those kind of really famous reputations also have very large endowments, which means that over the decades, they've accumulated wealth from donations from their alumni and from investments they've made and so on, that actually make them quite very wealthy universities, to the point where places like Harvard and Yale, if they wanted to, they could pay everybody's fees 100% in order for them to attend university. So they have very large pools of cash, or at least investments that they can draw from, that the public universities generally don't. And depending on what state you're in, your state in the United States could be quite supportive of what's going on at for your universities, or you might have a state that's actually been gutting the funding year after year after year. This doesn't really happen in Australia. That is, that in Australia the universities are largely being financed by the federal government, and so the federal government is just equally applying the funding across all of the states of all of the universities, whereas again in America it can be much spottier in terms of where the funding is coming from and how good the funding is. Also, the other thing I just need to mention is that we talked about the HEX program in Australia, but in the United States what happens is that students pay some of the costs out of pocket, obviously, but they're also going to try to get scholarships. They're going to try to get grants that allow them, based on their family's income, to maybe pay for some of the costs, and these grants would not be things they'd have to ever pay back. Or what probably a largest number of students do is they just go ahead and take out loans. And these are basically low interest loans that can take 10 to 15 years to pay back. And they usually require that you start paying them back as soon as you finish university. And so it's a huge pressure for a lot of students that they take out tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of dollars in loans that they then have to pay back, while they're also trying to buy their first home, set up their family, and so on. They got this monthly payment they have to make to pay off their university fees, which you can imagine, as an Australian student, you could think how Americans then would possibly want to defer even going to university until they could afford it, and maybe never even go because of the cost of borrowing that kind of money. Let's move on and talk about some other differences between the two. First of all, you should remember that in Australia we're below the equator here, and so our summer is actually going to occur in December, January, and February. So it's the end of summer when university starts in Australia. So we generally start our academic year at the end of February, beginning of March, whereas in the United States, the end of summer is going to be more like August, September. And so you're going to see that in the United States, the academic year starts in August or September. And so that's something just to keep in mind, because if you're transferring from one to the other, there might be a gap that you have to wait 6 months or something in order to catch on to the calendar of the other country. Now, what about admissions? Now, that's a really interesting difference between Australian and American universities. Domestic Australian students, in order for them to go to university, the main thing they focus on is doing really well in their final year of high school on tests. And these tests are called the ATARs, or they used to be called OPs here in Queensland, or they might be taking an international baccalaureate and taking exams there. But anyway, the point is you take these exams at the end of year 12 that basically reflect all of the hard work you've done in years 11 and 12, and then the exam scores that are the same exams that are given all over the country, or at least in all over your state, then determine how well you've done, and also it takes into account a little bit about how your school did on those exams. And then you get an overall score, and that score that you get is what's going to determine how you go to university. So they don't have SATs, they don't have ACTs, there's nothing else, no other comprehensive kinds of tests like that. There's just these tests, these ATARs that they take in year 12. And also in New South Wales, they have a different name for it. I can't remember right now off the top of my head. But you would take these exams, and then that would determine your future, okay? And so what happens is if you want to go to university, you then define, if you want to go to university, you then decide what course you want to follow. That is, in American terms, you would call that a major. But in Australia, you'd say, for instance, I want to study psychology. So if you want to study psychology at the University of Queensland, for example, you would go online and say, I'm going to apply to the University of Queensland for psychology. And then you'll enter what your score was from your ATAR. And that's pretty much it. You indicate what your course is, what courses you're interested in. You enter your ATAR scores, or else maybe the ATAR scores are actually just passed automatically from the system of taking these exams. But that's it. There's no interview, there's no essays to write, there's anything about your extracurricular activities. It's just based on this score. And then that score determines which major you can go into. And you can imagine what they do is they sort of rationalize the system by, they go ahead and say, for instance, that if you medicine and law are going to be very, very popular, so you have to have an incredibly high score, like a 99 or 100 to get into those. Things that are less popular are going to have a lower entry requirement for the score. But again, it's just all that score. That's the only thing that they focus on in terms of admissions. And students find out their score in December, and then they figure out which university they want to go to in January, and then they're already at university in February. So the whole thing happens very quickly in terms of, finding out and being admitted to a university here. International students have a similar sort of admissions process. They may supplement their essays with other background materials about their schools and so on, because they're not going to have that same ATAR system that was used, or the IB system that was used for Australian domestic students. And so they could supplement their applications with other things, but they're generally going to try to, the Australian system is going to try to convert your information to that same sort of ATAR score when you get admitted to Australia. So again, I don't think you would actually have to write an essay to go to an Australian university. You wouldn't have to have an interview. You just basically are doing it on your exam scores and having it converted to that system that the Australian students use. Now what happens in America is completely different. It's a much more grueling process, and I can tell you that because I did this as a student myself. I also have a son that's been going through this system. And what you do to go to the American system is you then have to not only take an exam like the SAT or the ACT, which are these exams that are just given generally to everybody who wants to enter university. You also would then provide your GPA, your grade point average, usually for the last 4 years of high school. You would also write some essays about who you are as a person, why you want to go to that university. And you would also give them sort of a CV of a bunch of your activities that you've been involved with, extracurricular activities, president of a club that you, did band for 4 years, that you started some charity drive at your campus. All that stuff goes into the package. And then finally, some universities also have interviews. So if you make it through the initial cut, they're going to have like a local alum or somebody on Zoom interview you. So all of that information gets fed into the admissions, and then you then decide which university you're going to get into based on which university is admitted you, right? And so in Australia, generally students just apply to 1 or 2 universities. They tend to go to the university that they live nearby. So in Queensland, a lot of the Queensland students just go to the University of Queensland or to QUT or to Griffith, which are in the Brisbane area, and they just only apply to 1 or 2 of those schools, and that's it. Americans tend to apply to a larger number of colleges or universities. They might go to their home state's university because it's the cheapest one. So for instance, if they're from Texas, they might go to Texas A&M or the University of Texas at Austin. But they generally apply to more colleges and universities across the spectrum. So you'll see a large number of places that you can apply to, and then it's just a matter of figuring out if there's a good match. That whole process goes on for many months. You find out, by April or May of the year that you're planning to go to university. You've got another month to decide whether or not you want to accept that university's offer of admittance, and then you would go off in August or September to start university. So there's a bit of a delay there, and that happens largely during the end of your final year of high school that you're applying to it. So that's one of the big key differences between the two, is just how they do their admissions. Now, what about the length of time that you're at university? Now, the length of time is actually quite different between American and Australian universities. And this has to do with that idea that goes back to the establishment of Australian universities were based on a British model. So in the UK and in Australia, there's this general sense that when you go to university, you immediately specialize. So what you do is, as I mentioned to you before, in high school in Australia, you're going to determine what course of study you want to go to. And you say, I want to go into psychology, or I want to go into engineering, or I want to go into nursing. And so you indicate that as your course of study, and then you apply to a university hoping that your scores are going to be high enough to get you past the threshold to get into that particular program. There isn't any such thing as an open major here. You can't just declare that nothing. You can't say, I want to go to university and then figure things out. You could be admitted as a psychology student and then change after a year or two. But the thing is, the universities in Australia are already specialized or focused immediately. As soon as you get into your first year of uni, you're already working on your course of study as your main thing. So for instance, first year psychology students in Australia are going to be taking 4 or 5 courses right away in their first year, and maybe another one from their second year as soon as they start university. Whereas when I was an undergraduate psychology student at the University of Iowa, I didn't even take a psychology class until my second year at university. So even though I was a declared major in psychology, I waited until my second year to start taking psychology classes. Why is that? Well, again, in Australia, you're really specializing in psychology or maybe another degree, and you're gonna just pretty much have all of your classes done on that. There are some electives that you could take that are also going to be from other departments, but you mainly are just taking psychology classes if you're a psychology student. And so then, as a result of that, you're done in 3 years. You can actually receive a bachelor's degree in 3 years at an Australian university. It shows that you are basically have expertise in that field. And then if you need to, if you want to, you could go ahead and take a 4th year to do an honors degree. Now, also you could be doing multiple degrees. You could take, you could do 2 courses. So for instance, if you want to do psychology and sociology, you may take 4 years because you would actually do all the requirements for psychology, all the requirements for sociology, and then have a dual degree. Again, in the United States, much more open. Many colleges and universities allow you as a freshman to be undeclared, to say that I don't want to say what I'm majoring in yet. I just want to be admitted on my good grades, my SAT scores, or whatever it is. And then while I'm here at university, I'll work my way through and figure out what I want to do. And what you do is, in the United States, is you declare a major eventually. Some universities make you declare your major in second year. Some universities allow you to construct your own major. You can actually take different courses and put them together and have like design your own major in those 4 years. The big difference then is that in the United States, there's much more of a focus on generalist education. That is, that you're learning more about how to think and write and so on more broadly. And then you're only really getting your specialization in those final 1 or 2 years of university, with the thinking that if you really want to specialize in psychology or engineering or nursing, you're going to go ahead and do further study after that undergraduate degree. So that's why people would go on and do a master's or a PhD in psychology, because they've just sort of got the basics of psychology, the basics of being a student and being educated in literature and arts and so on, and then they're going to go get specialized. Whereas the Australian student is already, after 3 years, has a bachelor's degree. They then go on and do an honors degree in their 4th year, and then they supposedly already have the specialist requirements that are necessary for their degree. So that is quite a different philosophy in higher education between Australia and the United States. I'll just mention that there is an exception to this, which is the University of Melbourne about 12 years ago introduced something called the Melbourne model, where they wanted to have this more broad sort of education, not making people specialized right away, but they still didn't change the number of years. It still meant that you would get a degree after 3 years or possibly an honors degree after 4 years, but you would not necessarily specialize right away in your first year and just only take the classes in your major or your course of study. And so that model was quite revolutionary at the time. It's meant to be more in line with a lot of other models of universities in Europe that also require or emphasize that your first few years of university should be more generalist and then you become a specialist. It's really just the British and the Australian models that have this sort of very highly focused specialist thing right away when you first go off to university. And so my students psychology students at UQ are pretty much just psychology students only. Like I said, they could be taking a second degree, but they're highly skilled in psychology, but they're not necessarily widely read or take courses in philosophy or politics or in art history, that kind of thing, the way I might have found when I was teaching at university in the United States. The next thing I want to talk about is just a little bit about the living arrangements, how they're different between Australia and the United States. In Australia, students, like I said, tend to go to university in the same town, or at least in the same state that they went to high school in. And so as such, a large number of students who live in these big cities in Australia, these capital cities they're called, like Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Perth, they tend to live at home when they go off to university, or they get an apartment nearby or something like that. Very few students actually live on campus in Australian universities. In fact, many universities don't even have any accommodation for students to go to their university. At the University of Queensland, we also have these things that are called residential colleges. Some of these colleges are affiliated with different religious groups, some of them are more independent. But the idea is that you could, if you wanted to, like let's say you're from way up north in Queensland and you want to go to the University of Queensland, you could live at a residential college that's kind of like a dorm, where there's other people who are majoring or studying different things across the university. And for the 3 or 4 years that you're at university, you could live at that college, eat with these other students, and have social activities. So that is a small sliver of students, though, who are at residential colleges. Most students are not living that kind of life. In fact, universities don't even have in Australia like board plans where you would have dining halls or places where you would eat regularly. We in fact have like cafeterias, or they're called refectories. Also some third-party companies that come in, like McDonald's or a Mexican chain or something like that, it'll serve food on campus, but you can't get like a board plan where you would eat at the same place every day at the dining hall, because most students are actually going to be living in apartments or living with their parents and doing their cooking there. So we don't have that sort of sense that you would have of living on campus, living in dorms, except if, of course, you are a student at a residential college. Now, in contrast, at universities in the United States, most big universities and colleges in the United States, students go far away from their home. Like I actually went 3 hours away from where I had gone to high school. And so I lived on the University of Iowa's campus in my first 2 years in a dormitory. I had a board contract. I would go and eat with my friends every lunch, and dinner and breakfast. And you would see your friends while you ate your dinners, and you had these nice cooked meals, and you had all you could eat and so on. It's still the case now that you could go to a college or university in the United States, live on campus, have a board plan. Some colleges, in fact, require you to buy their board plan, so it's going to be a cost that you have to include in the overall cost of going to university. But the main idea there is that this is your home away from home, because most students go away from where they were at high school to go off to college or university. And since they're moving away, they're not at home, they're not going to have an apartment, they're not going to even have necessarily the friends that they had in high school. They go and live in these places, at Cornell or at University of Illinois or at the University of Washington, and they can live there with other kids, with other students while they're actually attending university. Also, another thing that's different there, of course, is that universities and colleges in America have the Greek life. They have these fraternities and sororities, which are more like private sort of homes where people can belong and live in that building, that Greek house, that fraternity or sorority. Or you don't even have to live there. You could just be part of that group organization. They don't have Greek life in Australia. There isn't anything like fraternities and sororities here. The closest thing, again, would be something like the residential colleges that have their own house names and the college's name and so on, but there isn't a Greek life here like there is in the United States. So what's the social life like then for an Australian student versus an American student? I would say that the social life in Australia, from what I can tell, is that you pretty much do most of your activities off campus. So you're going to have friends that you knew from high school, or friends that live in your apartment, or whatever, or maybe some friends you met at class, but you generally do things off campus. You go to bars, you go to clubs, you go to festivals and so on that are not attached to the campus. So we don't really have a whole lot of going on campus in terms of a social life. There are some key big events that happen throughout the year, but you're just basically not going to be on campus very much in terms of having a social life. As opposed to those universities and colleges, again in the United States, where students have traveled great distances to attend that college, and maybe there isn't anything else to do there because they're in a small town someplace in Massachusetts or in Iowa, and so they tend to have their entire social life built around that university and parties and things that are going on in the dorms and so on. That doesn't, like I said, happen very much in Australia. Much more of a flavor of life that you would see in an American university. Just say one other thing about class size. Now, you'll see that Australian universities have gone up greatly in their enrollments over the years, and they are very dependent on, these days, on international students to be part of the enrollment. And this is because the federal government hasn't been funding universities at the high rates that they used to. And so one of the ways the university has made this up is by enrolling international students that they charge higher fees to, and so they can get this extra income. So Australian universities have gotten very good at enrolling international students. In fact, I think on a per capita basis, Australia is #1 in the world enrolling international students. So they very much depend on international students. They also depend on having large classes, large numbers of students. So when you go to an Australian university, your classes are going to generally be much bigger than they would be in the counterpart in the United States. Now, partly this is because the universities themselves are really large. Like our largest university is Monash University down in Victoria that has something like over 70,000 students that attend that university. So these large university classes mean that you're not going to get a lot of contact with the professors. In fact, most of the contact is going to come from what are called tutors, who teach tutorials. In fact, the tutors do pretty much 50% of all the teaching at an Australian university. So you might go to a lecture to see the professor in a big auditorium or on Zoom or whatever it is, and then go to a tutorial that has like 25 or 30 students as like a discussion group or to do activities in the tutorial. At American universities, you can find the same thing. You could find very large public universities in the United States would have that same sort of structure, where you have very large lecture halls with a professor giving a big lecture. But you'd also then have like discussion sections that are led by a teaching assistant. Generally speaking, at some of those liberal arts colleges and some of those private universities, they have much smaller classes, and so you have a better faculty to student ratio. That is, the number of students per professor is pretty small, and that means that you're much more likely to have interactions with a university professor in the United States at one of those kind of places than you would, for instance, in Australia, where the classes are much bigger. In fact, that metric of faculty to student ratio is a metric that you see a lot of universities in the United States get ranked on. So if they're a university that has a lot of small classes where students can very frequently have contact with a professor, like in a smaller seminar, a class with 20 or 30 people, those kinds of colleges tend to get higher rankings on university rankings in the United States. If they use that same system here in Australia, which they have, Australian universities do very poorly because they have terrible faculty-student ratios for the most part, for the exception of some smaller programs. You're just really not going to have that much of an opportunity to spend time with the professors the way you would at some of those colleges and universities that are in the United States. Again, I'm trying to point out that there are obviously universities in the United States that are just the same sizes and have the same sort of financial challenges that Australian universities have. It's just that in America you have a little bit more choice in trying to find some of those other places that would have a better faculty-student ratio, which you just really can't find very easily here in Australia. I have just a couple final points to mention. I wanted to go ahead and talk to you about the way that homework and assessments go in Australia. In Australia, they like to use this term assessments. And so one of the things that students want to know right away is what the list of assessments are for your particular course. And so assessments would include things like taking an exam or writing an essay or assignment. It's typical that in Australia that the university courses only meet once a week. So you would have your lecture once a week and maybe having a tutorial once a week. So you would have relatively few times that you're actually in class. And you'll also have fewer assessments, fewer assignments that you would do compared to an American university or college. So we have actually been limited at my university now to having only 4 types of assessment that can happen during a course. So I might have a weekly problem set to be done, but then I'm only allowed to have like 1 midterm exam, 1 final exam, and 1 essay, because I can only have 4 pieces of assessment. In the United States, I think it's still quite common to have many pieces of assessment, have lots of homework, and it's more common there to do all these different pieces of assessment that we would have compared to Australia. Typically, an Australian student is taking 4 courses per semester. In the United States, you could have something equivalent to that. We also have some universities in Australia that are on the quarter system, so they have shorter terms. Our semesters at the University of Queensland are 13 weeks. I think it's roughly the same amount of time that you would see in the US. But as I said, I do believe that I spent more time in the classroom when I was in the US than I do in Australia, because again, more of my teaching gets passed off to the tutors who do more of the teaching here in Australia. Finally, when you're all done with university life here in Australia and you actually are ready to graduate, they call it commencement in Australia. So you go to your commencement, and because the universities are so large, they don't tend to do one gigantic commencement for the entire university. They tend to have a lot of satellite ceremonies, breaking it up by psychology or nursing or whatever it is, and having these much smaller meetings. I think, again, that's probably true in some of the large universities in the United States as well. They tend not to have like a common commencement speaker. It's not like the tradition in Australia that you bring in somebody famous to give a big commencement speech. In fact, all these different satellite ceremonies might have different people giving the commencement address. So it's a very different sort of thing. It feels different, at least the way that commencement happens here. It's over a 2-week period, and they have lots of different activities that happen. And they do these commencements in July, and they also do them in December. December is when most students would be graduating and finishing up university. So that's all I have for now. It tells you a little bit about the undergraduate life in the United States and Australia. It's lots of information, and as I said, I hope to have a part 2 to this, in which I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about some of the differences as a professor being in Australia versus the United States. So that's all I have for now. Thanks very much for tuning in. If you like this vlog, if you like this video, please consider subscribing and liking this video. Also, I really would welcome any comments or questions that you have, and leave them down below. So thanks again. Bye.